we're back to test the new 1080 Ti Amp Extreme to see if Zotac has redeemed themselves with this new card. This card is one of the biggest on the market, taking nearly 3 slots, cooling with 3 fans, and using the biggest heatsink we've yet seen on a 1080 Ti. The unit is also priced at roughly $750 to $770, and so you'd think that it'd be pretty good at cooling, but we'll see how that goes throughout the testing. This testing will be largely focused on thermals and noise because, again, all the 1080 Ti's really have about the same gaming performance. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. You can help out by going to patreon.com/gamersnexus and checking out the pledge rewards and options, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt. And again, thank you to our readers who occasionally send us loaner hardware for review. So here it is, the Zotac 1080 Ti Amp Extreme. Again, one of the largest that we've reviewed. The only one that comes close or is more or less equal to it is the Gigabyte card that we have here, the Extreme Aorus card. They're about the same width. The Zotac card is longer, it's heavier, and is competitive in terms of slot requirement, which is almost 3 at this point. So it's a big card, and all of that space is really allocated to this aluminum heatsink. It's a large heatsink. We'll measure the thermals and things like that in a moment. And then the rest being the shroud. As far as the external areas of the card go, it is a 3-fan cooler, and these are synchronously controlled. It's not asynchronous fan control. They have 6 heat pipes underneath, with 5 of them protruding out of the right side of the card, facing it, and then 1 of them routes through the left half of the heatsink. For LEDs and effects, the card has 1 in the back plate for the Zotac branding, which lights up with a digital LED, so you can get a more fluid transition color to color, and there are also digital LEDs on the top and bottom, and then 1 in the top nameplate. And then you've got the GeForce GTX branding on the top of the card, which is a requirement by NVIDIA. The only people who've gotten around doing this that we've seen is ASUS with their Strix ROG card, which actually we have right here, because the ASUS card has a sticker that you can peel off, but it says GeForce GTX on it. So I guess they bypassed the rules a bit. But that's the outside of the Zotac card. In terms of the core specs, it's a 1080 Ti. They're all the same in terms of gaming performance out of box, even with pre-overclocks. So what you're left with is the cooling solution and the noise, and then I suppose the power solution. For the power solution on this, they are using 2 8-pins for the input, and then it's a doubled 8-phase using a UP9511 controller in 8-phase mode that's doubling and going to basically a 16-phase format, with 14 of those where the VRM normally is, and then the other 2 phases in the bottom right of the card, kind of under their own heatsink separately. Speaking of the VRM, it's got its own heatsink. It's a small aluminum fin stack. It is not connected to a base plate, so they've done that differently on this card from the others. There's no base plate on any part of the card. It's just PCB screwed into the heatsink with the separate VRM heatsink, and that VRM heatsink has on top of it a rubber bumper pad, which is theoretically used for noise damping, but is completely pointless because with a card this large and with 3 fans spinning at the lower rotational speeds that they're spinning at, you really shouldn't have any vibration, and we didn't even when we removed the pad. So that's pointless, but the rubber bumper could be used to help prevent the fin stack from flexing as much in the event that the user applies undue force during installation, which is probably the more likely use since the pad doesn't actually make contact to any part of the card when it's left undisturbed, as our photos show. The pad does not contact the chokes, so isn't used for coil whine reduction, and instead sits with a hair's thickness gap between the VRM heatsink and the padded aluminum heatsink's underbelly. But that covers the basics of the cooling solution. The rest is a copper cold plate for the GPU, and then an aluminum cold plate for the VRAM, which sinks into the same aluminum fin stack as everything else. Let's get into the testing. As always, you can find the testing methodology in the article linked in the description below. We are focusing on the thermals and the noise for this one, and we're also doing a noise normalized test at 40 dBA for all the cards that we've benchmarked so far with this method, where you can look at the thermal results versus the fixed 40 dBA noise output. Starting with the stock thermals chart, we see that the 1080 Ti Amp Extreme card operates its GPU temperature reasonably around the 66 Celsius mark, and that's when under auto conditions, by the way, basically out of box, We'll look at 40 dBA testing in a moment, but this auto configuration also places the card's power component temperatures in the 90s, nearing 100°C with a steady state temperature of 95 Celsius. The VRAM is around 81 Celsius steady state. Before getting to the comparative charts, here's a look at one of our GNEQ charts, basically a steady state, to show the thermals under various test conditions. Overclocked, our GPU temperatures remain steady when operating at a fixed RPM, so we're soaking the extra 20% power and plus 50 MHz core pretty well, and the VRAM increases by about 2C from our plus 400 MHz VRAM overclock. Not bad. The VRM components, however, are pushing up to 98 Celsius external temperature from the measurement we're taking, and that's with a 22 to 23 Celsius ambient with one 120mm fan providing airflow over the backplate. If you put this card in a case, it would not be unreasonable to see a 40 Celsius internal ambient temperature, which would boost the VRM temperatures into the range of 110 plus Celsius. Now, a few reminders here. Just like with EVGA's ACX card, this is technically within spec. Zotac isn't breaking any specifications here. It is running hot though, and the thing is, even though you're technically within spec, under 95 Celsius for VRAM, and under 125, maybe 150 Celsius on the VRM, depending on which component you're looking at, even given that condition, it doesn't mean it's okay to run so hot. And the reason is because this card is massive. They have all of this area to provide cooling and get rid of the heat that's generated by the components, and they can't outperform something that is almost half its size, about an inch smaller in terms of just the cooler alone. Or even the SC2 card, the EVGA SC2 card, or even the Founders Edition card. The VRM's running hotter on this, and no, they're not the same VRM components. Of course, that's a big part of it, but the thing is, Zotac has the ability to correct this. It's just a matter of poor design for the thermal solution, and we'll kind of show some of our own tests where we fixed it somewhat with a hack job, but just some thermal pads basically, and got it working a bit better. So yes, it's within spec, but it's not good. It's too hot for the expensive price, $750, $770. Really, anything over $700 has no excuse for that kind of performance. And even the $700 MSI Armor card, which by all accounts was an awful card other than the PCB itself. The Gaming X PCB was its one saving grace for H2O. It's worse than that card in terms of thermal performance and getting rid of the heat in the power component areas. And it's a bit warm in the VRAM, but not nearly as bad as with power comparatively to the other cards. Let's get some perspective. Looking at other devices on a steady state chart, we're now testing for thermals with noise normalized at 40 dBA output. The MOSFET chart positions the Zotac Amp Extreme 1080 Ti so significantly hotter than the other cards that it's actually impressive. That is, it's impressive they've managed to design a heatsink and fan solution so bad at cooling. And that's with one of the biggest cards on the market. This is a 3-fan cooler that takes nearly 3 full PCIe slots, and somehow it's managing a 72 Celsius delta T over ambient power component temperature, or nearly 100 Celsius if you ignore that delta T over ambient bit. And that makes this card 20C hotter than the previous worst card on the bench, the 1080 Ti Armor, and the 1080 Ti Armor uses what is effectively a 1070 cooler, though it's a bit buffed. Looking at 40 dBA VRAM temperatures, where we see a 58.3 Celsius delta T over ambient temperature, with the 1080 Ti Armor still worst on this particular chart. This places the Amp Extreme around where the Gaming X and FTW3 performed. Not bad for Zotac here, but then again, the VRAM is cooled directly and actually uses thermal pads to contact the cooling plate. Kind of hard to screw that up. It's more of a standard solution in that department for VRAM, so they've done well at keeping that normal performance, I guess. GPU temperatures at 40 dBA are also somewhat reasonable, with the Amp Extreme at 42 Celsius delta T over ambient. This is around where the FTW3 and Gigabyte Extreme Aorus cards performed, with the ASUS Strix ROG card still hanging on to the title for best air-cooled card we've tested so far. The next coolest are both under liquid. So then, why do we see the high temperatures we see with this card? Well, a lot of it is actually not the fans or the fan RPM. A lot of it is, in fact, the way the cooling solution is handled. Right now, because this is a loaner card, we have to send it back to its purchaser, just a reader like the rest of you, or a viewer. And so we've done a mod for him where we've replaced the original rubber bumper that's in here on the VRM components with thermal pads. And those help a decent amount, as we'll see. But the reason that the temperatures are so high to begin with is partly because of that rubber bumper that just sits between the large heatsink and the small heatsink, with one, not actually any contact between them, so there's no reason for it to be there. And two, it should be a thermal pad, where just like ACX, where EVGA overlooked or whatever you forgot or cheaped out on or whatever they did to not put thermal pads where they now have them everywhere on the board, Zotac did not put thermal pads here. So that's part of the problem. The next part of the problem is that Zotac is using a backplate that ultimately acts as something of a hot box or a thermal insulator. And it helps trap some of the heat, which we've seen in the past on some cards. Again, EVGA ACX comes to mind, where when we added the thermal pad to the back of the card between the backplate and the PCB, which is something that EVGA provided for free to make this problem go away on their own devices, this card does not have a thermal pad there. So it's got the same kind of problem where it's just trapping heat, and in some areas that causes temperatures to spike. And we actually removed the backplate for some future testing in a moment and saw an improvement. So those are part of the reason that this card is running warm, the other just potentially being the power design in general. So let's look at the thermal pad that we added on top of the VRM heatsink just to see what the difference looks like. We actually had to do this by stacking two thermal pads because we didn't have a thick enough unit in stock to actually put on there. This limits performance since you're now transferring between two interfaces, which means that our fix, so-called, isn't even that good. But it's still better than what Zotac shipped initially, and they definitely have access to better thermal pads than we do. The difference in power component temperatures is an improvement of 7.1 Celsius, moving from roughly 94.8 C to 87.7 C. Using a better thermal pad, or just a single thermal pad, would improve that further. And here's where it really gets interesting. If we remove the back plate for the next test with the original rubber bumper on the VRM heatsinks instead of that thermal pad, and with the fans fixed to around 45%, which is about what the auto would give you, for both benchmarks, we see that Zotac is incinerating its own card with what amounts to a plastic backplate, or at least a plastic wrapped backplate. With the backplate removed, the GPU temperatures remain more or less the same. We're at a 2C difference, which is still an improvement, but not exciting. What is exciting, though, is that the power component temperatures improved by about 13 C, that's 95 to 82, which is completely reasonable for a VRM temperature. Both are within spec, but 82 is alongside what most of the other cards perform at when they are in the 1080 Ti class. So in terms of gaming performance, again, all the 1080 Ti's are more or less the same once you get a decent one that resolves the potential thermal limitation of something like a Founders Edition card, where you can boost higher if you have a more controlled GPU core temperature. So anything that's got an aftermarket cooler that we've tested and shown to be good, the exception being something like another blower cooler, like the Aero cards, for example. Once you've gotten into that class of better cooler, they really are all the same for gaming performance. For overclocking performance, they're mostly the same as well. The only time you start getting into a difference is when you go Kingpin class or Lightning class or something like that, and you get the extra switches to disable limitations, or you get the extra clearance to add LN2 pots without having to rework the board. Those are a different class of card, and those can certainly push higher more easily in the overclocking department. For these cards, the buy out of box and use cards, they're about the same. So we've kind of ruled out gaming and overclocking performance as a reason to buy one card over the other. What you're left with is things like price, looks, if that matters to you. We're not really going to comment on that. And then thermal and noise performance. Thermal and noise performance, the ASUS Strix is still hands down the best cooled card in terms of noise output. At 40 dBA, it performs better than everyone else until you get into liquid class, and it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon unless we get our hands on some other new advanced card that we don't have already. So the Zotac card is not impressive enough to warrant a purchase versus its nearby competition, which would be the $750 to $770 class. So $770, you look at stuff like FTW3 and ASUS ROG Strix, with the Strix kind of leading in that class. Both of them are a bit superfluous. You're not going to get a whole lot better out of them other than really specific low noise performance. If that matters to you, then perhaps they are worth considering, but then again, so is liquid at that point. So you look at the $750 class, you start getting into the territory of an SC2, the ICX version, or some of the Gigabyte cards, the Gaming X. The Gaming X and the SC2 are pretty good in the $750 class. They are, the Gaming X especially, fairly quiet, and they cool better, at least on the power component temperatures, than the Zotac card does. So it's kind of hard to find a place for this one. You can make it better with thermal pad mods, which we've kind of done, and we'll leave it that way and ship it back to Josh with the thermal pad mod on it. But you're basically buying for the looks at that point. Do you like the digital RGB LEDs? Yes or no? There's your answer of if you should buy this card. It's not the absolute worst thing that Zotac has ever built, but it's also not that competitive with other cards on the market given the price. So that's all for this one. Thank you for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. Click the link below for the article. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and I will see you all next time. Where you can look at the thermal resort. Come see our volcanic lava events at the thermal resort.